It began as these things often do, not with the clamor of sirens or the careless flicker of blue lights, but with song, a thin gold thread of sound, rising through the winter-dark cloisters of Magdalen College, even song, choral and ghostly, brushing the vaulted ceiling like a memory misremembered. I had not yet been summoned then. That would come later, long after the candle smoke had thinned, and the voices had drifted off into whatever quiet places they go to die. Professor Julian Hartley had attended evensong that evening. He sat alone, just beyond the organ's reach, in a pew too polished to have known regular use. His shoulders were slightly hunched, not so much with age as with the weight of something long unspoken. Beside him, a toy, a small, cracked thing, shaped like a carousel, its paint flaked and pearled with age, the kind of object one associates with childhoods no one remembers fondly, and lullabies sung by those too tired to mean them. The choir sang Nunc Dimittis with an austerity that was almost defiant, and Hartley did not move. Not for the blessing, not for the dimming of the sanctuary lamp. Only when the bells began to toll did he stir, and then only to glance, almost absently, at the toy. It played, not loudly, not even clearly, but with a sort of tremulous insistence, as if the melody had waited decades for this moment. I'm told several people noticed. No one commented. Oxford has long since trained its inhabitants not to speak of oddities. We simply file them away, somewhere behind the poetry and the mild regret. It was Lewis who called me. Just after 10. A body, he said. Magdalen College. They think it's natural causes, but I don't. The phrase hung in the air a moment, as if he knew it would snare me. I didn't ask why. I already knew. Hartley's rooms were what one might expect of a scholar who had grown used to time passing unnoticed. Books layered deep enough to muffle sound. A gramophone, not a modern one, and a small tower of dusty records, many of them played until the grooves had surrendered entirely. A narrow bed, unmade though untouched. The armchair, by contrast, bore the indelible marks of habitual use. That was where he was found, not sprawled, not twisted, but folded inwards, hands clasped gently like a man preparing to listen, not to speak. His eyes were open, but then, death often wears that expression, mild surprise, faint curiosity. The letter was beside him. Cream vellum, heavy with the scent of pipe smoke and something almost like ink, but not quite. No envelope, no signature. Just a phrase repeated 3 times, in a hand that leaned backwards as though retreating from its own certainty. That which was hidden shall sing. Lewis hovered, tactfully out of reach, which was his way of being near. I murmured something about the coroner, and wandered to the window. A thin fog had begun to settle against the panes, softening the outline of the new building across the quad. In the diffused light, the toy, the carousel, gleamed faintly from the mantelpiece. It had been placed with care, as though it mattered. I lifted it. It was heavier than expected. Swiss, I thought, perhaps late 19th century. Music box mechanism, probably driven by a mainspring. I turned it over. The base had been pried open, once, and left unsecured. No batteries, no winding key. I replaced it, and stood still, trying to hear the silence. A silence that wasn't quite whole, more like the aftermath of something almost forgotten. The letter, the toy, the expression on Hartley's face, none of it felt like conclusion, more like overture. Lewis cleared his throat, quietly. They say he had a heart condition. College nurse found the prescription. I nodded. That didn't mean he took them. There was, near the hearth, a volume of Shakespeare open to the tempest. Be not afeared. The aisle is full of noises, underlined twice, once with ink, once in pencil. Hartley had been a musicologist of some repute, though his reputation, like much else in Oxford, had calcified into a sort of ceremonial irrelevance. Still, he had once written a celebrated treatise on silence in the Baroque fugue. I recalled a lecture in which he had said, quite dryly, that music only reveals what words conceal, a sentiment I've never fully trusted, but tonight, in that narrow room with its uneasy stillness, I could almost believe it. I turned the letter over once more. No watermark, no creases. A fresh thing then. Recently written. Meant to be found. I folded it carefully and slipped it into my coat. It was not Hartley's death that troubled me. Death has become a tedious companion, but the arrangement of things, the music box, the unsigned note, the fact that he had attended evensong despite not having done so in years, as if something had summoned him, as if someone had known. Outside, the bells struck 11. The sound lingered, barely perceptible beneath the fog, like the end of a melody that still hung in the air, waiting to be heard again. Even now, I'm not entirely sure when the case began, but I suspect it was when that toy played its song and no one asked how. There's a kind of cold, particular to Oxford mornings, a distilled quiet that seeps into stone and thought alike. Magdalen, with its ordered angles and watchful gargoyles, wears the hour with a kind of ritual restraint. Lewis met me just inside the main gate, shivering slightly, though he'd never admit it. We passed under the bell tower without speaking. Some places simply ask for silence. Hartley's rooms looked different in the pale light, less like a scholar's sanctuary, and more like a mind packed too tightly. Books stood in militant rows, scores, treatises, and facsimiles annotated in a hand that had not wavered in decades, a metronome. Unmoving, cast a long shadow across a side table. The bed remained untouched. No signs of struggle, no panic, only a single pressed handkerchief placed with peculiar symmetry on the windowsill. The kind of precision that makes one uneasy. It was Lewis who noticed the photograph, tucked between 2 volumes of Monteverdi, as if deliberately placed for discovery. 4 young people, 2 men, 2 women, dressed in that half-defiant, half-elegant fashion. The 60s produced at its better universities. One held a cello, the other a violin. A young Hartley, barely recognizable, gazed directly at the camera with a look I can only describe as reluctant promise. The back of the photograph bore no inscription, only a faint fingerprint in what might have been varnish. I slipped it into my pocket. The copy of The Tempest still lay open where I'd found it the night before. But now, with the morning's brittle detachment, the underlining struck me differently. Be not afeared. The aisle is full of noises, inked once in black, then again in fading blue, a layering of emphasis or a change of mind. Hartley had marked other passages, but none with such obsessive return. That line hopeful yet unsettling. A promise of enchantment, or warning of deceit. Lewis cleared his throat in that polite way of his. The porter's up, said something odd. Might be worth a word. We found him in the antechapel, fiddling with a lamp that refused to light. A man of few thoughts, but good memory, the kind Oxford relies upon more than it admits. He hadn't much to offer, except this. Hartley, reclusive by temperament, had taken to receiving late visitors in the past fortnight, always after midnight, always hushed. Once, the porter said he caught a fragment of the visitor's voice, female, or at least soft enough to pass as one, posher than most. Not young, but not old either. Sounded like someone trying not to sound upset. A woman's voice at midnight. A cracked music box on the mantel. And now, a photograph from a time Hartley never spoke of. I began to feel the faint outlines of a shape, not yet visible, but present. Back in the rooms, Lewis idled by the desk. He gestured toward the lower drawer, found this. Might be nothing. The drawer contained loose papers, mostly lists, books, lecture notes, invitations politely declined, but buried beneath them, folded once and then again into thirds, lay a torn crossword, the top half only, yellowed but untouched by time. Someone had begun to fill it in, but only a few clues. One in particular had been done in a hand more recent than the others, slightly bolder, as if tentative. Toy, without power, still sings. The answer filled the vertical boxes. M-U-S. I sat with that a while. Muse, a toy without batteries, still sings. There was something too apt, too deliberately poetic about it. A voice remembered, or a longing that never dulled. In either case, someone had written that clue with Hartley in mind. Or perhaps someone was the clue. The muse, and he, the powerless toy. Or was it the other way round? Lewis said something practical. It rarely matters what, and left to ring the coroner again. I stayed a little longer. The toy carousel had not moved since last night, but I imagined absurdly that I could still hear its music. A hollow tune, not absence. Exactly, more like a sound, paused mid-breath. Hartley had not died of surprise. He had died, I think, of something returned. I met her in the cloister, just before the service, her breath clouding faintly in the morning chill. Leonora Vile, once a soprano of considerable acclaim, now draped in black that shimmered faintly at the hem. As though even grief in her case required stage lighting, she extended a hand without warmth, then withdrew it before mine had fully reached. Her voice was softer than I remembered from recordings. Time had not silenced it, only thinned its edges. The effect was more powerful than I'd expected. We spoke in the porter's lodge, under a clock that ticked with ecclesiastical precision. She did not ask what had happened to Julian. She seemed to know already. I remarked on the music box. She tilted her head. That thing? I gave it to him. Years ago. He hated it. Said it played out of tune. Then, after Anna died, he asked for it back. Wouldn't say why. Anna. I asked her name without meaning to. Anna Mallory. Cellist. Brilliant. Fragile. Drowned in 72. Leonora said the date the way some people say diagnoses. Julian loved her, in his own impossible way, but he was already married to something else. Silence, maybe, or sorrow. They rehearsed together, often alone. The quartet fell apart after she died. No one ever really said why. The death had been ruled an accident. I recalled. No note, no warning. Leonora's face, narrow, composed, darkened slightly. No note doesn't mean no cause. She was young, idealistic. She wanted too much from music. Julian. He wanted only to listen. After the service, brief, ornate, untouched by sentiment, I visited the vicarage in North Oxford. Reverend Peter Halberd answered the door himself, still in his cassock. The house smelled of old wood and rosemary. He remembered me from a college dinner years ago. I remembered nothing of the sort, but nodded politely. He poured tea with the exaggerated precision of a man long accustomed to ritual. Julian, he said, had been a man who understood everything except comfort. There was always something cracked in him, like a cello with a broken bridge. You could play it, but it would never sound quite right. I asked about Anna. She was the only one who ever made him laugh. That's how I knew he loved her. He laughed and then he stopped. After she died, he composed nothing. He taught, drank a little, collected theories, but he never played again. He asked me once if grief could be conducted like an orchestra. I asked if they'd ever considered her death suspicious. We did, quietly. But we were boys, still pretending to be men. No one wanted to ask the wrong question, especially not Julian. He buried her twice, once in the ground, once in himself. Before I left, Halberd mentioned something odd. Julian had called him a few weeks ago, out of nowhere, asking about wills. Not his own, oddly, but something more general, inheritance. He said, possession. I thought he was working on a paper. In a way he was. The Bodleian was hushed, as always, but the winter had brought an extra stillness to the reading room, as though the books themselves had withdrawn into thought. I requested Hartley's personal archive, such as it was, a few letters, annotated scores, and a manuscript tucked inside a green folder labeled simply, On Silence. The text was dense, unfinished, and wandered without structure, but there were moments of startling clarity. Observations about the pause between two chords, the importance of breath in phrasing, the necessity of restraint in beauty. One paragraph lingered with me longer than it should have. We do not fear silence because it lacks meaning. We fear it because it allows meaning to shift. I turned the pages slowly, as though something might speak if I moved too quickly. Toward the end, a marginal note caught my eye. Scribbled in a different ink, smaller, tighter, and as last phrase, not spoken, played. D. A motif, or memory masquerading as motif. Outside, the sun had dipped below the rooftops, casting Oxford in its usual late afternoon ambiguity, neither light nor dark, only the shadowed middle where things remain unclear. I returned the folder to the desk and walked back along Broad Street, past a busker playing Schubert faintly off-key. There was something plaintive in the sound, not sorrow, exactly, something thinner, regret worn down to dust. Hartley had loved a girl who drowned, had lived among echoes, reverberations. Now his own life had ended, not with a crescendo, but a rest, not silence, but the suggestion of one. And even then, still, the music played. The Oxford archives are not so much a place as a condition. Stillness pressed into paper, dust thickened into record. The clerk behind the counter recognized my name but said nothing. He led me to a reading table with the delicacy of a man escorting a ghost. The file was already waiting. Music College, Northumberland, closed, 1973. Reason: unviable finances. There are things more impolite than truth in this country. Suicide is one of them. The folder was thin. Too thin. A press clipping. Tragedy at Moorvale. Student cellist dies in Lake Fall. No photograph. The tone clipped, factual, desperately unemotional. Anna Mallory, 19, second-year student, gifted cellist. No witnesses. No foul play suspected. A suicide note had apparently been recovered. I turned the page. It wasn't there. The index listed it. Appendage 3, personal effects, Mallory, A. But someone had excised it, not carelessly. The removal was exact, the staple holes too neat. There was instead a slip, withheld at request of next of kin. No name given. No indication of whether Anna had any family. I asked the clerk. He shrugged, without even performing curiosity. Some records vanish because no one remembers to care. Others vanish because someone insists they should. Later that afternoon, I returned to Hartley's rooms. The college had allowed me one final hour before they were cleared for inventory. I took the toy from the mantelpiece and set it on the desk beneath the lamp. It was smaller than I recalled. The paint flaked, faded, formed faint roses across the horses like blush worn thin. I turned it over again. No batteries, no key. The inner mechanism, from what little I could see, resembled the spring drum models used in pre-electric pieces, but the coil was seized. It should not play, yet it had. I took it to a watchmaker's on the Cowley Road, an old man with hands like parchment who regarded the toy as one might a riddle from a dead friend. He examined it in silence, then gave it back with a faint frown. Swiss, yes. Late 1800s. Possibly made by Bontham or an imitator, but the springs locked. Solid. No play left in it. He tapped it once, lightly. Still, no sound. He handed it back. Perhaps it remembers its own music. I left before I could answer. There are explanations that silence makes more credible than words ever could. That evening, I found myself in the Turf Tavern, though I hadn't meant to go anywhere at all. Lewis was already at the corner table, 2 pints in. I joined him without greeting. He asked if I'd found anything. I told him about the suicide note or lack of it. He frowned, but only slightly. There was always something in his face that resented tragedy, that didn't leave fingerprints. I mentioned the toy. Told him it had no mechanism left, nothing to make the sound. Yet it played. He looked at me, half dubious, half expecting me to follow with a punchline. I didn't. I never do. I sipped the beer. It had gone warm, but not unpleasantly so. Music, I said, is the only thing that remembers without speaking. He nodded, unsure. You think she left the toy, Anna? Possibly. Or perhaps it belonged to her, or reminded him of her, or him of himself when he knew her. Grief makes archivists of us all. And the will. I shrugged. Hartley had asked Halberd about inheritance. He'd made no changes that we could find, left no statement of intent, but perhaps he wasn't leaving anything to be read, only heard. A pause. Then Lewis asked, gently, why would someone remove a suicide note? Guilt, or shame, or love, or fear? That too. We walked back slowly, the fog settling low across Holywell Street, softening the lights until they blurred. I thought again of Anna Mallory, a girl whose life had seemed, from the outside, full of promise and harmony, yet who had chosen silence, or been forced into it. What, after all, could she have written in that note that someone would still fear, decades later? And Hartley, what did he think he heard when the toy played? Not music, not quite. More like a memory, refusing to fade. A motif returning without resolution. In music they call that a suspended cadence. A question that never receives its answer. And so, the carousel sat once more on my shelf, still and mute. But I swear, later that night, as I poured the last of the whiskey, I heard it stir. Just one note. Faint as breath, but enough. They pulled him from the chairwell just after dawn, his cassock torn by reeds, one shoe missing. Reverend Halberd, Peter, to those who'd known him before faith had conferred its distance, had always walked beside the water in the early hours. It was where he claimed to think best. It seems, in the end, it thought back. The preliminary report was tactful. Slipped, perhaps. Wet banks, worn soles. A heart not young. But the postmortem corrected that fiction. Sedation. Diazepam, in the bloodstream, enough to quiet the limbs, dull the breath. Not enough to kill him. Just enough to make drowning seem plausible, or inevitable. I stood beside the slab longer than I should have. Death doesn't shock anymore, not its fact, only its arrangements. The small oddities it chooses to leave behind, like forgotten notes in a symphony otherwise familiar. Halberd's hands were clasped, as though in prayer or resignation. In the pocket of his coat, they'd found a photograph. Anna, again, different from the earlier one. This time she was smiling, blurred slightly at the edges, as if light itself had grown uncertain. The back bore a scrawl in Halbert's hand. Forgive. There was something else. Silver nitrate residue along the margins, the sort left by old, dark room chemicals. The photograph had been reprinted. Recently, I held the image beneath the coroner's lamp and considered whether guilt ages slower than the rest of us. Later, in the bursary office at Magdalen, I met Cassandra Wynne. She greeted me without greeting, a flicker of acknowledgement more precise than polite. Her hair was neat to the point of severity, her voice low and precise, as if she chose words for their architecture, not their warmth. She spoke of Halberd with the distant admiration reserved for men who've become anecdotes. A man of rhythm, she said. Rare. In clergy. Most prefer meter. He believed in the musicality of liturgy, that God could be sung back into relevance if the phrasing was right. I asked, when she had last seen him. 3 nights ago, here in this office, he brought a letter Hartley had written him. Nothing concrete, only implication. That things long buried have a habit of resurfacing when no one's watching. I made tea. He declined sugar. I asked about Anna. A pause, then a soft, almost amused nod. We shared rooms, briefly. She practiced constantly. The cello was like breath for her, intrusive, necessary. I preferred silence, but I admired her dedication. She was kind. In that way the very young sometimes are, believing kindness itself could correct the world. I asked what she had made of Hartley. Genius, of course. But that's rarely the whole of it. He listened too closely, if that makes sense, as though he expected every phrase to reveal something personal. It was exhausting. Did she love him? Another pause. Cassandra's hands were folded carefully over a ledger. She tilted her head. I think she tried. But love, real love, doesn't flourish in echoes. It needs a steadier rhythm. We spoke briefly of Halberd's sermons. I'd heard one once, years ago. a meditation on lost time, misremembered hymns. She quoted Auden then, almost absently. Time will say nothing but I told you so. The line hung between us a moment too long. I asked where she'd heard that photograph had been taken. She didn't answer, only smiled faintly, as if remembering the wrong kind of thing. As I walked back through the college gardens, the cold crept in like a second skin. Somewhere beneath the surface of this, I could feel the shape of something hidden, not concealed in malice, but embedded through years of careful misremembering. 2 deaths, decades apart. One confirmed, one unraveling. A cello that never quite stopped playing. A musicologist obsessed with silence. And now, a bursar who quoted Auden as if he'd whispered directly to her. Forgiveness, I thought, is the cruelest demand we make of memory. And yet we make it. Again and again. And sometimes when the music ends, the ghost still listens. The Mallory house had long since given up pretending to belong to the living. Ivy clung to its face like memory to a faded photograph. Uninvited, persistent. A wind moved across the hedgerows in fitful sighs, carrying the scent of dry leaves and damp soil. The key had been provided by a solicitor, whose voice cracked on the word estate, as though the building were resisting even that final dignity. Inside, dust, paper, the hush of rooms that had forgotten how to echo. The living room bore no personal trace, only the sediment of years. It was Anna's room I had come for. The stairs complained underfoot with every step, but gently, like a house unused to visitors and trying to be polite about it. Her room was small, a single narrow bed, the iron frame now rusted faintly red, and a desk under the window that still bore the outline of her inkwell. The wallpaper had begun to peel in soft curls. Nothing was staged, nothing preserved. There was no shrine here, only the absence of one. The floorboards near the wardrobe were warped, a section slightly looser than the rest. I pried it up, carefully, expecting little. What I found was a journal, wrapped in oilskin, the kind sold in stationers for sentimental children and melancholy poets. The entries began in summer ink, wide loops, optimism barely contained. They were filled with musical notations, fragments of imagined concertos, and passages about Hartley that veered between reverence and despair. He listens like no one else, she wrote. He hears what I'm afraid to play. Then, toward the final pages, the handwriting shifted, not just hurried, shaken. The loops collapsed into angles. Words broke mid-sentence. The margin grew thick with crossouts. And finally, he promised me a symphony. I heard only silence. I closed the journal not out of discretion, but grief. Not mine, hers. Some pain insists on being private, even after death. Later that day, I found myself in the Radcliffe camera. I wasn't searching, not precisely, only moving through spaces where thought lingers longer than people do. The air was thick with chalk dust and ambition. A few students murmured over tea-stained paper, and 2 older scholars sat beneath the dome debating Eliot, as though it were a kind of liturgy. One of them said, quite firmly, "It's these fragments I have shored against my ruins, not from." The other objected. The difference, he insisted, was irrelevant. But it wasn't. Not to me. Against suggests intent. A wall. A defense. From implies origin. The fragments are not weapons, they are remains. It was enough. Back in my flat, I poured a glass of claret. It had breathed too long, and I drank it anyway. The toy carousel sat on the table, inert, the silence around it oddly warm. I thought again of the journal, of that trembling line. He promised me a symphony, and wondered who she had written it for. Hartley, Wynne, or no one except herself. I turned on the lamp. The hour pressed in. Somewhere beyond the walls, the city moved. Students gathering at pubs, bells preparing their old songs. The air smelled faintly of rain. I considered whether it is possible to fall in love with a voice. Not the person behind it, but the sound itself. The tone. The phrasing. the unspoken music between words. Leonora Val had such a voice. She had spoken to me the way some people sing, reluctantly, precisely, as if knowing each word might become a ruin or a fragment. Her voice held sorrow, yes, but also control. The performance of someone who had once sung for applause, now speaking only for herself. I sat with that thought until the claret grew thin and the room quieted further. The toy did not play, but I imagined the sound of a cello, low, aching, incomplete. Some ghosts arrive not to haunt, but to be heard. It was not a confession. Not exactly. Leonora Vale did not confess. She revealed carefully, like a woman drawing open a curtain, not to let in light, but to examine the dark on the other side. We were in the garden quad, under a sycamore that had lost its leaves too early. The wind carried a faint chill, but she wore no coat. Some people resist warmth as if it implies weakness. I asked her directly. She didn't flinch. Yes, she said. I had a child, a son. 1971. I was 24. I told no one but the matron, not even Julian. Especially not Julian. She did not explain why. I didn't ask. There was pain in her voice, but it was the practiced pain of someone who had replayed this aria too many times to ever get it wrong. The dates aligned too neatly. Anna Mallory died in 72. Could a child have bound the two women in ways not even they fully understood? Or had Leonora, in some strange echo of that tragedy, chosen secrecy over inheritance? And Julian, had he ever suspected? Could it be coincidence that he asked Halbert about wills, about ownership? Or was he trying, even at the end, to find a name he'd never known? Back at the station, Lewis stood by my desk with that awkward patience he reserves for days, when the case begins to sour into human difficulty. He had a file open, worn from the college's reluctance. I found something, sir. Halbert wrote a private letter to a bishop, back in his early seminary days. Took some digging. He handed it to me. The handwriting was tight, clerical, as though confession required containment. I read it slowly. Most of it was rote. Uncertainty, humility, questions about the vocation. But one paragraph stood apart. There has been a tragedy. Not mine, but close. Beneath strings and skin, something broke. I helped cover it. I thought it mercy. Now I think it was cowardice, dressed as kindness. No names, no detail, but enough. Strings and skin. The language of music and flesh. It could only have been Anna. I closed the file, rubbed a thumb against the edge of the page. Halbert had known more than he let on. Perhaps he had helped hide the pregnancy, or shielded the identity of the father, or perhaps he had protected someone else entirely. And still the puzzle turned. Later that afternoon, I requested a review of Hartley's college accounts, the kind no one likes to open. The bursary, perhaps out of guilt or simple exhaustion. Obliged. In the ledgers, a pattern, small but consistent withdrawals, listed under discretionary funding, every quarter, like a heartbeat, paid to a trust account in Surrey. No name, no invoice, just the soft footprint of secrecy. They stopped 3 months before Hartley died. I took the numbers to Lewis. He frowned. That hush money, possibly. But hush for whom? The child. Maybe. But if Hartley never knew about the child, then who was silencing what? We sat in silence, the kind that doesn't settle so much as stand guard. I thought again of the carousel, a toy meant for children, kept by a man who claimed to abhor sentiment, and Anna, who had written in her journal not of fear but of silence, a silence promised in place of music. Later, walking past St. Giles, I heard a violinist tuning on the corner. He played a G sharp, unsettled, then adjusted. It struck me then. A fugue begins with a subject, but its truth lies in how that subject is transformed, echoed, repeated in different voices. What had begun with a death was now speaking in variations. A drowned girl, a forgotten child, a brother who never asked the right questions, a priest who said too little, too late, and Leonora, her voice still perfect in its tremble, carrying a secret like a note sustained just beyond the breath. In the music of guilt, no one plays solo. I had begun to suspect the toy carousel would never sing again. And then, by accident, or fate's faintest indulgence, it did. A low, tinkling refrain, brittle as memory, played one brief revolution as I set it down too firmly on the desk. The sound arrested me. It was not lovely. It was knowing. The kind of melody one recognizes only because it has accompanied something once lost. I took it to Somerville, where a retired musicologist, blind for nearly 2 decades, sat in a room that smelled of waxed wood and ink. Her fingers, long and paper dry, hovered above the toy, as if listening through touch. "Play it again," she said, though it would not. But the notes had stayed with me. I hummed, hesitantly. "Ah," she said. "Der kleine Abschied," a 19th century lullaby. German. Literally the little farewell. Used by Mahler. Yes, and by Berg. Obliquely. A motif for loss, for the quiet vanishing. She smiled at nothing. They say children weep when it is played. Not because it is sad, because it remembers something they cannot. Back at Magdalen, I returned to the private storage in the college archives, a small, dust-walled alcove behind the bursar's office, the door stiff with disuse. In the far corner, beneath shelves of forgotten programs and silver-polished irrelevance, was a tin box. Locked, naturally. The key was in Hartley's desk all along, tucked inside an envelope marked St. James 7:16, a reference I had mistaken for a psalm. Inside, letters, neatly folded, some yellowing, one tied with ribbon, the color of dried blood. Most were unsigned, or signed only J, but one, hidden at the bottom, bore the single initial M. The handwriting was small and nervous, the ink pressed hard. It was Anna's. The note had never been sent, or perhaps returned. Either way, it was addressed not to Julian, but to her. The name never written. But it was not hard to deduce. "You said I was music, that I opened something in you no one else had touched. But when I needed you most, you gave me silence. You turned away, said it wasn't yours to carry. But it was. It is. You handed me back to the dark." Further down, I see now, there is no miracle in love, only arrangement. Like voices in a quartet. You chose the harmony you could bear. I broke under the rest, and then, the final line. Prospero had his staff, and broke it. I have nothing left to break, but myself. The page trembled in my hand. Not physically, I was still. But something in me leaned forward, listening. Prospero's staff. I thought again of Hartley's annotated Tempest. The line he'd circled. "Be not afeard. The isle is full of noises." The island. The music. The farewell. I turned to the recital records. The night Anna died, the student quartet had performed together. One last time. Hartley, Halberd, Anna, and Cassandra Wynne, piano. Not violin, as I had assumed. Her name was there, buried in the program. Miss C. Wynne, accompaniment. Accompaniment. The most thankless part. Present in every note, but rarely heard. I returned to my flat. The city was quiet, the kind of Oxford hush that feels rehearsed. The claret had gone sour in the glass, but I drank it anyway. On the table the carousel lay still again. No music this time. I opened my notebook and wrote out what I knew. A child born in silence, a quartet fractured by more than music, and a girl who had handed over her heart, only to find it returned unopened. Anna's last line had not been metaphor, it had been precision. I thought again of Cassandra Wynne, and her strange aside in our last meeting. Her thoughts on rhythm, on misremembered hymns. I had mistaken it for grief. It may have been guilt, or worse, deflection. The truth, like a fugue, was playing in different keys now. But the melody was the same. There is a particular sound in the old college hall when it is empty. Not silence. Oxford never grants you that, but something softer, a shiver between stones, the echo of chairs long cleared away. I stood alone in that space, where the quartet had once played its last concert, and let the air speak. It didn't lie. It only misremembered. I turned slowly, the architecture yawning upward in arches that knew more sorrow than prayer. The piano, untouched for decades, sat beneath a dust cloth, like a monument modest enough to forget its own inscription. I ran a hand along the edge, not for evidence. I had stopped expecting that, but for continuity. The notes once played here still lingered. Somewhere. It was the hymn that had brought me back. Not the melody, but a line casually dropped by Cassandra Wynne during our second meeting. She described a chapel service in the early 70s, said the boys sang a line, "He who by morning's light has fled." Something about the phrasing itched. Back in my flat, I had leafed through old hymnals until the itch bled. That lyric, in that form, hadn't appeared until a redrafting in the 1983 revision. Prior to that, the line read differently, stiffer, more Victorian. She could not have heard what she claimed in the years she claimed to have heard it. Wynne had lied. But why? And more strangely, why about something so small? Unless, like all true liars, she lied best when it seemed to matter least. I left the hall, the doors creaking behind me like a voice thinking twice. Outside, a sudden shower hissed against the paving stones. I didn't shelter. It helped to think with water running in my ears. At home, I retrieved Anna's old review, a brittle clipping, folded into her journal. It wasn't easy to read. The ink had faded and the grammar was arch, theatrical, but her turn of phrase had teeth. She wrote of Leonora Vale's performance at the Royal College, a voice of such clarity. It risks disconnection. No soul, only brilliance. It leaves the listener cold, awestruck, but untouched. At the time, it had struck me as literary posturing. But now I wondered, was it a rebuke, a warning, or a wound? Anna had known Leonora intimately. Perhaps enough to cut her at least. Enough, certainly, to be cut by her. So the triangle grew. Leonora, pregnant and estranged. Anna, gifted and betrayed. Wynne, intelligent and invisible, watching from the margins of music where the viola lives. Neither melody nor rhythm, but the haunted space between. 4 of them had played that night. Anna on cello, Hartley on violin, Halberd on piano, Wynne on viola. I could hear them. Not the notes, but the emotional geometry. The quartet had been a crucible, each player burning at a different temperature. The music had held just long enough. Then Anna had drowned. I turned to Louis, who had returned from a routine check of staff records. He had that look again, faintly sheepish, like a man who's found something that shouldn't exist but does. "There's a new research assistant in the college library," he said. "Started last year. Bright, quiet, doesn't say much. Name's Matthew Lath. And, well, he was born in April 1971. Adopted. Record sealed." But Louis paused. His adoptive parents were both music teachers in Surrey. He handed me a photo. The resemblance was not obvious. The eyes were wrong. But there was something in the tilt of the jaw, the withdrawn way he looked slightly past the camera. I had seen that in Hartley. And now I considered it in Anna too. "He doesn't know?" I asked. "Not exactly. But I think he suspects. Apparently he's been asking around about Anna Mallory. Said he found an old letter among his father's things, signed with an A. The child, not a child any longer. Working among the ruins of the story that made him unaware, but circling. I leaned back in my chair, the world quietly tightening. So much had been arranged to keep him from the truth. Wills, lies, hush money, misremembered hymns. But music, as I had once said to Louis, remembers without speaking. And it had begun to hum again, imperfect, hesitant, but irrepressible. A lullaby played on a toy without batteries. A name scribbled once in love, once in guilt. A harmony misheard, finally heard again. I had been wrong before, more often than I like to admit, though I suspect I carry each error more closely than any solved case. But this time, As I walked the long corridor to Wynn's rooms, past the stone arches damp with evening rain, I was certain not of guilt, that's a foggy word, but of rhythm. And rhythm never lies. Her door was slightly ajar. I didn't knock. Inside she sat by the window, pale in the light of a flickering desk lamp. A copy of The Tempest lay open beside her, the same edition Hartley had annotated. I noted the passage, "Our revels now are ended." A finger rested lightly on the line. Whether by accident or design, I could not tell. I said her name, not loudly, but as if naming something one had buried and hoped would not rise. She turned slowly. Her eyes were dry. I had not expected that. "You knew," I said, letting the words take their shape carefully, "about the child, about Anna, and about Hartley." For a moment she said nothing, only reached forward and with a delicate motion switched off the desk lamp. The room fell into shadow. "It felt right. I didn't mean to," she said at last. She was going to ruin him, and I loved him. But Anna, she always had the power to unmake things. "You pushed her." A nod. Or something near to it. Just once. Just one gesture. We were by the river. She turned. She laughed meanly. "I think now." And I reached out. Not even hard, but the ground was wet. And she slipped and drowned. She bit her lip, but still no tears. Only a brittle kind of composure. Hulbert was there. He saw. He said God would understand, that we must protect the boy. Hartley, he never knew. Or rather, he never asked. He mourned her in his own way, composed silences where music should be, taught without speaking of her, drank quietly, listened obsessively. A life of not quite confession. And the toy, it was Anna's. I found it among her things. I sent it to Julian, years later, anonymously. I thought perhaps it would be a kind of penance, or a reminder. I don't, but he removed the batteries. She gave me a faint smile, one that barely rose to her eyes, because he wanted it to continue, without reason, without explanation. He wanted a world where things kept singing, even when they shouldn't. I let that silence settle. Outside, the wind rattled something loose in the ivy, a dry branch, perhaps, against the gutter. "The photograph in Halbert's coat, was that yours?" "No." His own guilt, I think. He kept that picture of Anna for years. I believe he thought of her as unfinished. "He died for this. We all did," she said, and her voice at last broke. Just not all at once. Later, I stood in Hartley's rooms again. The air still bore his absence. On the desk, I placed the toy porcelain, chipped, absurdly delicate. I turned it once, though there was no mechanism. I had verified that. Still I waited, and there it was, the melody. Inezum memory, bright as regret. A children's lullaby now played in mourning. No batteries, no wires. Just sound, impossibly given. Louis stepped beside me, uneasy. "You sure it's not a trick?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. There are things that outlast explanation. Grief, music. The need to let the past hum a little longer in our ears, before the quiet resumes. I sat in Hartley's chair, poured one last measure of his claret. On the wall above the fireplace hung a reproduction of Mahler's manuscript. He too had quoted the same lullaby. Morse's law. Louis might have said, "Even the dead find ways to speak." But I was thinking of something else. A voice once described by Anna Mallory as brilliant, but soulless. Another, described by no one, but now, echoing still. Leonora's, Cassandra's, Hartley's. Even the child's, though he did not yet know his role in the chord. The quartet had played its final note long ago, and yet somehow it lingered. The toy played music. It had no batteries. I left the room as I had found it, unresolved. The case, as they say, was closed. Paperwork filed, statements taken. Some signed, others withheld. Wynne had resigned quietly, citing health concerns. I suspected Oxford would protect her, as it always does its own. Halberd was buried in the college chapel with all the requisite murmurs in Latin. No mention of Anna Mallory in the eulogy. The past, as ever, tidied into silence. Michael, the child none of them claimed but all had shaped, remained at Magdalen. Still a porter, still unaware. He had a way of nodding too politely, a curious gaze when one spoke of music, and a habit of humming in the corridors. Once I passed him in the cloisters and caught a snatch of melody, broken mid-bar. I thought of telling him, but the moment passed, as such moments do. I asked him the time instead. By the river, the leaves were beginning to fall even though it was early for autumn. Lewis joined me there, standing awkwardly in that way of his, shifting on his feet as if reason itself were uncomfortable. You think we should tell him? No. He deserves to know, perhaps. But not all truths are kind, Lewis, and not all lies are unkind. He frowned, scratched his neck, stared at the water a long while. You ever wish you didn't know the things you know? He glanced sideways at me, said nothing more. We walked in silence, the sort that used to feel like companionship. Lately it had begun to feel like distance. Later that afternoon I stood at Oxford Station. Leonora was leaving again. Her luggage was modest, her clothes immaculate in that way only grief and opera singers manage. She wore gloves though it wasn't cold. We exchanged few words. She thanked me not for justice but for something smaller, more intimate. For not simplifying him, I nodded. That at least I could accept. The train was late. She began to sing. Not loudly, not to a crowd. Just a phrase, half heard, from Schubert's Winterreise. A line about wandering, about snow underfoot. Her voice cracked on the last note, and she stopped, embarrassed. I wanted to tell her it was beautiful. I did. She boarded without looking back. The doors hissed closed. I stood there until the platform was empty again. That night I sat at my desk, the crossword half done, a glass of whiskey untouched beside me. The room was still. The toy sat on the table, silent. The final clue lingered. Music born of sorrow, unspeaking, yet whole. For I stared at it longer than I should have. The answer had always been there. I just hadn't wanted it. I wrote. Echo. Of course, not song. Not voice, not muse. Echo. Not original but repeated. Not created, but remembered. A sound that returns, hollowed. The room didn't feel warmer for having solved it. I reached for the whiskey, but didn't drink. Outside, the wind rose, touched the eaves, pressed against the glass. Somewhere, a shutter banged. A dog barked, and was still. And then, quite clearly, the toy played. Just once. The same frail tune, brief and fading. No mechanism, no reason, no witness, but me. I did not move. Perhaps it had always done that. Perhaps it had never stopped. A lullaby. Old as regret. A note held, impossibly. And in its final echo, silence again.